true epic stories of the Berlin Wall. Imagine staring at a concrete wall that splits your city, your family, your future, and knowing that crossing it could cost your life. Faced with that wall, would you break through, rise above, or fly across? It's a question only the boldest dared to answer, and by the end of this video, you just might have your own answer too. These are 3 true stories of the Berlin Wall, like you've never heard before, wild, daring, and unforgettable. The acrobat who danced across the Berlin Wall, the true escape of Horst Klein. In a city wrapped in silence and suspicion, where the air itself seemed to watch and listen, freedom came at the cost of everything. And for those who sought to cross from East to West Berlin during the early 1960s, the wall was more than just a physical barrier. It was a line between light and shadow, between the known and the forbidden. And among the many who dreamed of escaping, one man chose not to dig beneath the wall, nor to leap over it in a car or crawl through barbed wire. He chose instead to rise above it step by step on a single swaying cable under the cloak of Void. Darkness. That man was Horst Klein. Horst was not a soldier, nor a spy, nor a political figure. He was a circus performer, an acrobat, a tightrope walker, a man trained to dance with gravity on the thin thread of danger. But in East Germany, under a regime that feared anything it couldn't control, his talents became a liability. Horst had once thrilled audiences with his skill, performing across stages in both East and West Germany. He'd been a star under the big top, a master of balance and poise. But after the Berlin Wall went up in 1961 and the Iron Curtain descended in full, his world shrank to a narrow stage one where art was monitored and movement restricted. The East German authorities viewed the circus with suspicion. It was too flamboyant, too Western, too free. Performances were curtailed, then canceled. Horst's career collapsed, his bookings vanished, and soon the artist found himself without a stage, without a purpose, and without a voice. But he was still a man of balance. And he was still a man with vision. As months passed, Horst watched the wall grow taller and stronger. It was not just one wall, but layers of fencing, watchtowers, anti-vehicle trenches, and what they called the death strip, a cleared zone where escapees were gunned down without warning. And yet, like so many others trapped behind it, Horst dreamed of the world beyond. Unlike many, however, Horst had an eye for heights. And that's when he began to notice something others did not. In a narrow sector of Berlin's Mitte-district, he found 2 buildings, one on the east, one on the west, standing just a narrow alley apart. And strung between their rooftops, some 30 feet off the ground, was a single slender telephone cable, once used for communications, now all but forgotten. To anyone else, it was debris. To Horst, it was a path. Night after night, he studied the patrols below, the rhythm of their boots, the sweep of their searchlights, the habits of their dogs. He counted steps, noted blind spots, and timed how long each sector was left unguarded. And all the while, in his mind, he walked the cable. Again and again, feet steady, arms outstretched. He didn't tell anyone. Escape attempts were punishable not only by death, but often meant prison time for family, friends, and neighbors. Secrecy was survival. And so he trained in private, rehearsing his footwork, practicing his breathing, visualizing the sway of the cable. Then, one bitter winter night in 1962, the moment came. It was moonless and quiet, the kind of night where frost clung to every surface and sound traveled sharp. Horst dressed in black, climbing up to the roof of the eastern building without a whisper. He carried no rope, no bag, just the long, narrow balancing pole he'd crafted from an old curtain rod and wood. He stepped onto the edge, peering down into the alley below. Far beneath, a guard paced, unaware that above him, stood a man who would make history. Horst climbed onto the wire. The cable groaned softly, adjusting to his weight. It wasn't tight like a performance rig. It swayed slightly, cold and coarse beneath his feet. He inhaled, focused, and took the first step, then another. He moved. Slowly, deliberately, like a ghost in flight. Each foot landed in silence. Toes curled slightly to feel the vibration of the cable. The cold bit through his clothes, and the wind tugged at his arms, but Horst was undeterred. Midway across, he paused. The guard below had stopped, perhaps sensing something, or merely adjusting his coat. Horst froze, body tense as wire, heart pounding in his ears. One wrong move, and it was over. Then, movement resumed, and so did Horst. Step by step, meter by meter, he closed the distance. The cable narrowed in his vision, the rooftop of the western building growing larger with every heartbeat. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, his foot touched rooftop. He was across. Horst dropped to his knees, hands gripping the edge as he scrambled over the lip and disappeared into the night. Behind him, the cable still swayed gently in the air, as if waving goodbye to the world he had left behind. In West Berlin, he was met not by spotlights or reporters, but by silence. He had made it, and he was free. When word of the escape spread, in the following days, the story became legend. Newspapers dubbed him the tightrope defector, the wall walker, and the flying Berliner. Children whispered his name, and other would-be escapees took heart from his courage. But the East German authorities were furious. They moved quickly to remove the cable, seal the rooftops, and increase surveillance. They denied the story, suppressed the details, and erased his name from records. But it was too late. Horst Klein had humiliated them, not with violence, but with elegance. Not with guns, but with grace. In the years that followed, he lived quietly in the West, never seeking fame or fortune from his feet. He returned to performing briefly, but mostly stayed out of the public eye. And yet, his story endured. Not because he crossed the wall, but because of how he did it. He didn't run through a hail of bullets. He didn't tunnel through the mud. He didn't drive through barricades. He walked a lone figure balanced between tyranny and liberty, with nothing but courage beneath his feet. And, in doing so, he proved that even in a world divided by fear, the human spirit could rise above it all. Quite literally. The man who rammed the Berlin Wall, the true escape of Wolfgang Engels. In a city torn in two, where freedom was measured in meters and hope was hunted, one man didn't scale the Berlin Wall. He smashed straight through it. Our story begins in the heart of Cold War Berlin, in the year 1965. The Berlin Wall, a brutal barrier of concrete and wire, had stood tall for nearly 4 years. It split a once united city into East and West, communist and free. Along its path ran death strips, machine guns, and orders to shoot without hesitation. It wasn't just a wall. It was a message. You will not leave. And yet, people tried. Hundreds of them. Some tunneled. Some climbed. Some swam through canals in the dead of night. And then there was one man, Wolfgang Engels, who didn't sneak around the wall. He rammed it head on. Wolfgang was just 24 years old, a mechanic in the East German Army. His job was to maintain the vehicles of the National People's Army, specifically armored personnel carriers. These weren't just trucks. These were beasts, Soviet-built BTR-152s, 8-ton war machines built for battlefield durability, with thick tires and reinforced steel. By day, Wolfgang wore the uniform of a loyal soldier. But behind closed doors, he hated the regime. He didn't believe the propaganda. He saw how the wall had torn families apart and turned neighbors into enemies. And most of all, he dreamed every single day of being free. But in East Germany, dreaming of freedom was a dangerous thing. For months, Wolfgang pondered a mad idea. He had access to armored vehicles. He knew their systems inside and out. And he knew that one BTR 152, if driven fast and true, might just be able to plow through the wall itself. It was madness. But sometimes madness is the only map to freedom. Then came the opportunity. One April afternoon in 1965, Wolfgang was assigned to transport ABTR for a parade rehearsal. It was fully fueled, unsupervised, and crucially, he was alone. Instead of heading to the rehearsal ground, Wolfgang turned the beast down the streets of East Berlin toward Bernauer Straße, an infamous stretch of the wall where East met West like a raw wound. Every second was a risk. If he was caught detouring, he'd be arrested. If anyone radioed for orders, it would be over. But no one stopped him. As he neared the wall, people on the street stopped and stared. Soldiers were confused. Was this a drill? Was it a breakdown? No one could imagine what Wolfgang was about to do. He stepped on the gas. The BTR 152 roared like a beast unleashed. It gained speed, tires grinding the road as buildings blurred past. The border guards began to shout, unsure what was happening. A siren blared. Guns were raised. And then, with a deafening crash, the vehicle slammed into the wall. The reinforced concrete cracked, buckled, but didn't break. The armored vehicle punched halfway through, its front emerging into West Berlin, but its back end stuck. The wall had bent, but it hadn't yielded completely. And that's when the bullets began. East German guards opened fire, panicked and enraged. Bullets struck the BTR's steel sides. Some pierced the vehicle. One hit Wolfgang in the upper body. Bleeding, dazed, and exposed, he kicked open the heavy side door. Smoke and concrete dust filled the air. He climbed out. Wounded and stumbling, Wolfgang crawled through the rubble, past barbed wire and broken stone. The air itself seemed electrified by gunfire. The guards kept shooting. But Wolfgang was running, not just for his life, but for the West. And that's when two West Berliners saw him. Ordinary citizens, just onlookers, sprinted toward the bleeding man in the tattered uniform. Risking their own lives, they reached across the last stretch of no man's land, pulled him over a small fence, and dragged him to safety. The moment Wolfgang crossed the line, the shooting stopped. For the first time in his life, he was truly free. He was rushed to a hospital in West Berlin, where doctors fought to save him. The bullet had torn through his chest and lodged near his spine. It took weeks to recover. But Wolfgang survived. And when he awoke, he found himself in a world he had only imagined, where newspapers were uncensored, where no one feared the secret police, and where people could speak their minds without looking over their shoulders. His escape was hailed in the West as a heroic act of defiance. The story spread through newspapers and television. A lone man had driven a Soviet armored vehicle into the wall and escaped under gunfire. It sounded like fiction, but it was real. The East German regime was humiliated. They tried to suppress the story. There was no mention in the state media. No images, no explanation, just silence. But on the streets of East Berlin, the tale spread like wildfire. A man had rammed the wall. He hadn't asked permission. He hadn't waited. He had simply gone. Wolfgang Engels never returned to the East. He moved to Hamburg and became a biology teacher, living out the rest of his life in relative quiet. He never saw himself as a hero, just a man who chose not to live in a cage. The Berlin Wall would stand for 24 more years after Wolfgang's escape. Hundreds more would die trying to cross it. But his story remained one of the most audacious and unforgettable of all the escape attempts. In the end, the wall didn't fall because of governments. It didn't fall because of treaties. It fell because of people like Wolfgang, who refused to let it stand unchallenged. He didn't climb over it. He didn't dig under it. He drove straight through it. Zipping over the wall, the Beth brothers' daring escape. In a city carved in half by politics and paranoia, where soldiers stood ready to kill and walls cut through neighborhoods like a knife, escape was more than an act of courage. It was a declaration of the human will. And in 1964, three brothers from East Berlin, Ingo, Holger, and later, on another day, Beth would engineer not just one, but multiple jaw-dropping escapes from the clutches of East Germany, each more daring than the last. But the first, perhaps the wildest of them all, involved a homemade zip line that defied the very idea of impossible. Ingo Beth was the first to flee. In 1975, he paddled across the Elbe River in a tiny inflatable air mattress, evading border guards under cover of fog. But it was Holger who, a decade earlier, would set the family's rebellious legacy in motion. In 1964, the Berlin Wall was still relatively young, but already fearsome. Rising up with guard towers, mines, and a ruthlessly enforced death strip, it turned East Berlin into a prison city. Holger and Ingo, both in their early 20s, had grown up under the regime's watchful eyes. They were ordinary young men's sons of a carpenter who dreamed, like so many others, of freedom, family, and futures not defined by government dictates. But dreams behind the wall had a price, and the Beth brothers were willing to pay it. Holger, who worked in a chemicals plant, and Ingo, who was a trained electrician, began to watch the wall carefully, obsessively. They weren't content to flee blindly or recklessly. They wanted precision, stealth, and surprise. And then one day, while staring out from the attic of a building on Strelitzer Straße in East Berlin, Holger saw something that changed everything. Across the death strip, just beyond reach, stood another building in West Berlin, its rooftop tantalizingly close. The gap between them wasn't more than 60 meters. To most, it was an unbridgeable chasm, watched by guards with machine guns and spotlights. To Holger and Ingo, it was a challenge. Over the next few weeks, the brothers secretly gathered materials, coils of steel wire, a pulley, climbing harnesses, tools. It wasn't easy. Every purchase was suspicious, every movement watched. But they played the long game, disguising their intentions under layers of ordinary behavior. Then came the night. It was March 1964, cold, silent, and tense. The two brothers climbed to the attic, tools in hand, hearts pounding. They secured one end of the steel cable to the East Berlin building, threading it carefully through a small window near the roof. The other end, more dangerous, had to be fired across the divide. Using a bow and arrow, they launched a fishing line from the east to the west. A friend in West Berlin received the line, tied it to the steel cable, and slowly pulled it across, anchoring it to a chimney on the west side. It was a line from prison to freedom, with the steel cable now taut and anchored above the death strip. Holger clipped himself to the pulley, took a final breath, and pushed off. He zipped across the gap, wind screaming past his ears, the cold night air slicing at his face. Beneath him, East German guards stood unaware, patrolling the ground in rigid patterns. Above them, Holger Beth soared silently through the sky. In just seconds, he was across. His feet hit the rooftop on the west side, and he collapsed in disbelief. He had made it. Ingo followed, repeating the same process, body trembling but determined. And just like that, two brothers had escaped East Berlin without firing a shot, digging a tunnel, or triggering a single alarm. It was, quite literally, a flight to freedom. West German officials were stunned. The public was thrilled. The story raced across headlines. The daring duo who built a homemade zip line and flew over the wall. They were praised not just for their bravery, but for their inventiveness. But the Beths weren't finished. Years later, the third brother, Hugh, still trapped in the East, became their next mission. Holger and Ingo, trained as pilots in the West, bought a small ultralight aircraft and flew it back over the wall in 1983, landing in a remote field to pick you up. That escape was just as dramatic, but it began with the zip line. What made the first escape so extraordinary wasn't just the ingenuity. It was the quiet, calculated defiance behind it, the use of simple tools, steel cable, and raw nerve to defy a military superpower. In a world built on barbed wire and gun towers, two brothers turned gravity and rope into a revolution. They didn't crash a tank. They didn't crawl through the earth. They zipped through the air, unnoticed, untouchable. Their escape wasn't just a break for freedom. It was a message to every prisoner on the wrong side of that wall. There was always a way, even if you had to build it yourself, even if it meant stepping off the edge, trusting a pulley, and zipping into the unknown.